Hello, if you're watching on video, welcome to the inaugural On the Climate Record podcast. And if you're listening to the podcast, it's a real treat to have you here. Of course, on video, which I'd highly recommend, you can observe my rainforest frog socks and know this about me. I rarely wear boring socks. And my name is Christophe Jospe. I am the host of On the Climate Record, as well as partner of Carbon A-List, and I am so pleased to be joined here today with my fellow partner at Carbon A-List, Dr. Nicholas Gazer. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Christophe. I'm really glad to be here, and this is really exciting for me too to be here as we're forming the partnership and the strategy development. This is just an amazing time.
It's a dream come true. We're here in Madison, Wisconsin. Yesterday, I ate some cheese curds. It's really jokingly the only reason I came here was for the cheese curds, but a lot of other things happened while eating cheese curds. And we're sitting in Nick's living room so that we can literally have a fireside chat and talk about a lot of really important things. But maybe because this is the first episode of the podcast, maybe I could set out a bit of the vision of why do a podcast? Why have a podcast? There are a lot of climate podcasts out there. It's a saturated space. Do we really need another? I would answer yes. If you're coming to this podcast to just learn about what climate change is, why it's important, what you can do about it, this isn't the right place for you. Well, maybe on what you can do about it, but this is a climate change 102 or 200 level, 300 level college course where we really get into the details and nuances of what's overhyped, what's underhyped, what is actually happening, and what are the hard questions that aren't being asked, and how can we expose the opportunities at hand so the world can waste less time and money solving climate change. And for my personal story, I once got called a used carbon salesman by someone who was like, wow, you seem really obsessed with this whole carbon thing. And indeed I was. I went on to co-found a company called Nori and be on the Nori podcast, which, full disclosure, is a reason why I wanted to do another one. I miss doing podcasts, but Reversing Climate Change, great podcast. Check it out. My fellow podcaster, Ross Kenyon, is really a phenomenal host. We'll hope to have Ross on this show at some point. But at some point I left Nori because I realized it's not all about carbon. And here we are with a company with carbon in the name. And it's funny, we have this tagline, come for the carbon, stay for the ecosystem. And for me, that's what it's about. I didn't think that I'd be so active learning about agriculture, learning about the ins and outs of why agriculture is so important in terms of a general systemic shift that the world needs to make to live more resiliently and kind of manage all of the various aspects that we face in a changing climate. But it's not about the carbon. And we'll get into maybe why we feel that way, and yet why carbon is still such an important element in this global transition. So in this show, I think we're going to make it about you, Nick, because you're our host or you're our guest. And let's just start with your background. What's the path that brought you to sitting in your living room and recording this podcast with me?
Yeah, it's been a fun path, kind of bounced around a little bit. I grew up actually in a number of places throughout the state of Wisconsin. I was born in South Dakota to a dairy nutritionist and to my mom in South Dakota. My dad was working for an answer farm and within the dairy world, trying to advance dairy nutrition. He bounced growing up to Green Bay, Wisconsin, to Stevens Point, Wisconsin, and then ultimately we landed in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, which was about 15 miles from our family farm. And this is a family farm that my dad grew up on, and he went out to work in his career and came back to help advance and grow that dairy farm. So I grew up in that system, worked there growing up until about age 22, in which I went through college at the University of Wisconsin system, and I started taking on internships within the corn and soybean seed industry at about age 22. That dairy experience and upbringing taught me a lot about business operations, animal health and welfare and care. Taught me about the intersection between livestock and field crops and field production. A lot of different aspects of business, farm business management as well that were covered in that time, those formative years growing up. As I moved into the internships, got more familiar with corn and soybean seeds specifically, advanced through my school, my undergrad, in my grad career, ultimately moved from corn and soybean seed to vegetables. I completed a doctorate looking at analyzing potatoes, sweet corn, and snap beans. And in those systems, I was asking questions around nitrogen management. Potatoes, sweet corn, and snap beans, especially potatoes and sweet corn, demand a lot of nitrogen. And the operating systems, the farmers in the state of Wisconsin that produce these crops were experiencing drops in their margins. They were seeing the input costs go up and the commodity price, the prices for potatoes and sweet corn and snap beans go down. And they were asking about what are some value-added systems that they could explore. One of those was organic. They were wondering if there was an organic premium that could be paid to these crops to help improve their livelihood going forward. So moving through that, I looked at nitrogen, I looked at contributions from cover crops, looked a lot at soil health, water quality, looked at a little bit at air quality and some gaseous emissions from these crops as well, and from the soil as well. So trying to look at that well-rounded picture during the grad work. Graduated, moved onto a commercial potato farm in southwestern Wisconsin. It was an 1,800-acre potato farm, and I was hired to do agronomic research. And I did that. I had that underway, and about 3 months in, realized needed to do so much more than just agronomic research. This was moving into records management. It was looking at labor dynamics, marketing and storage decisions, because potatoes are stored year round and sold based on market fluctuations throughout a growing season. It exposed me to customer relationships and sustainability dynamics, sustainability assessments looking specifically at potatoes. And then in addition to that, it brought me into more of the regulatory policy world and thinking about groundwater issues, especially nitrate leaching into groundwater issues on a localized basis, working together to set up fertility management trials to keep the nitrogen in the ground, in the soil, and then moving into the crop and not into the water. Was there for about 1.5 years, a little over that, and decided I wanted to move on to jump back to the corn and soybean seed industry, and worked for Monsanto at the time, working as a technology development representative for most of the state of Wisconsin. And this was a really interesting position. I had the ability to look upstream in the pipeline, almost to discovery phase in the pipeline. And in addition to that, was able to work directly on farm and work with farmers to understand their key needs and their drivers in making business decisions and research decisions on their farms. Was there, and that opened up an opportunity to help lead a field crop, a cover crop field network throughout the Mississippi River Basin. And this was a public-private partnership where we partnered directly with universities throughout the Mississippi River Basin and conducted cover crop trials, looking at systems change and soil health dynamics and genetic improvements and things, weed dynamics, looking really across the agricultural systems to understand what those changes might bring or what changes might occur within corn and soybean systems as cover crops were further introduced. And we were doing this from the context of thinking about water quality, recognizing the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and looking at mitigation steps to try to improve nitrogen use efficiency for crop production and business management decisions that could bring a co-benefit to water quality at a localized basis within the upper Mississippi River Basin. And then as we went south, looking at the hypoxic zone. That position was interesting, and I started to engage with a broader array of stakeholders, and one of them was the National Corn Growers Association. And I could see their passion around farming and agriculture, and they were asking questions themselves around cover crops, around soil health, trying to understand what steps they could take internally and externally to help encourage farmers to improve sustainability and just understand the changing dynamics of what was happening from the water quality world at the time. In 2014, there was a piece of paper that slid across my desk that said the Soil Health Partnership at the top. with an opportunity to transition from Monsanto to the National Corn Growers Association to launch and lead this concept, the Soil Health Partnership. It was scoped as an on-farm research network, on-farm being exactly that, looking at production agriculture at scale, conducting field trials, with the presence and absence of many practices that today are considered climate smart agricultural practices. Specifically, we looked at cover crop presence absence, we looked at nutrient use efficiency, and we looked at tillage changes. And we didn't just stop at the practices, we looked very closely at soil health components, we looked at economics, we looked at full system inputs and management decisions throughout the growing season, and cataloged and collected those data, again, tying back to the records management and records discussions and thoughts that had started during the potato farm years. That position advanced. It was a great opportunity to learn a lot about development within the National Corn Growers Association, but also collaborations and partnerships, as this Soil Health Partnership was a consortium. It was a consortium with several partners, and they were non-traditional partners. We had organizations like the National Corn Growers Association, Monsanto partnering with the Nature Conservancy, Environmental Defense Fund. Then we had support from the National Wheat Foundation. We had General Mills providing support, and several others providing financial support and other forms of in-kind support to see this network grow and develop over the 4 years that I was there. I worked in that position for 4 years, and then transitioned from that point to a vice president role within the National Corn Growers Association. This vice president role was focused on production and sustainability. And within the purview of this position, I had the opportunity to look at climate change dynamics, pesticides, including insecticides, weed management control options, fungicide management control options. It brought me right into the policy world in a big degree, looking at policy discussions and decisions that could affect farm management, and a number of other topic areas like the corn yield contest within that position. I transitioned out of that role and took on a vice president role with the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance to launch and lead their science program. Ultimately worked on a number of different reports analyzing climate change opportunities for agriculture, and this was row crop and animal agriculture together, and advanced some collaboration work with a number of different grower organizations to lead that science program. After that career step, I worked and transitioned into the Tri-Societies. So this would be the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and the Soil Science Society of America. And in that position, I was a CEO, and I was brought in to help affect change and lead strategic development for the organization as they were in the middle of a strategic planning process. I was there for about 1.5 years, right over the period of time when the pandemic hit. It was very interesting leading them through not only advancement of strategic planning, but also through an annual meeting that went virtual, and some really tough management decisions internally, looking at member services, questions around publications, peer-reviewed science, and open access, and other business discussions that were happening in the science society world. That brings us up to March of 2021, when I reconnected with Christophe, and it's been amazing since then. So over the last 7 months, we've been collaborating, working to develop Carbon A List, and working at this interface of agriculture, climate, and, as Christophe alluded to, broader systems change, systems understanding and improvement for agriculture going forward.
Thanks for that amazing background. And Nick, I'm thrilled to be sitting here and recording this podcast with you. And there's a lot in your background that I want to dig into in the details, but forgive me if I describe you as a change maker. In some organizations, they're like, oh, we want change maker, but like go over there in your own corner and like, don't give us the real change. Like give us the change that looks good in a report and we can call sustainability, but let us keep doing our own thing. And one of the things I love about working with you is that's not good enough for you. You're a systems thinker, and you're a systems thinker who has context. You've gotten dirt under your fingernails, you've done the labor, and you know what the labor took, and then you zoomed out and have been working on the system ever since. Love that. But I want to ask you, what does change making mean to you?
That's a good question, Christoph. Change making to me means fully understanding the system in which we're operating, the operational environment, whether it's for agriculture today on the national basis, the international basis. It means fully appreciating who the people are and what are driving those individual, those very personal decisions and those behaviors. It means understanding the networks, the interactions between the personal decisions and those influence points, whether they be policy, whether they be influenced through social media or other media channels, whether it be educational or other pieces that way. And then ultimately, where I've worked is really by throwing myself right into the middle of the projects and trying to be action oriented. Um, Talk is great, but me personally, I like to jump into the middle of projects and help build or help modify, help enhance from the inside. And that's exactly the tact I've taken, is to not be afraid to get my hands dirty a bit and work together with people to figure out answers or solution sets to really, really tough questions.
Great answer. And it's easy sometimes. You get people standing up on the stage talking about how great some ecosystem service market is, or an incentive model that's going to drive regenerative agriculture, and it's a lot of talk. Hasn't necessarily done the hard work. And I don't mean to begrudge anyone or any one idea, but I think a recognition that it takes respect, and it takes working from the inside, and it takes accepting when you've learned something and maybe you're wrong. For me, I've learned that a carbon market is not necessarily the driver, the end all be all driver, if you will. Maybe it's an important element, and pieces of carbon accounting are critical, but to really drive sustainable or climate smart agriculture, it's going to take a lot more. And on my last day at Nori, I wrote an essay called Do It, Prove It, Sell It. And sell it is this, like, figure out how to sell a market instrument, and you got to prove it. You can sometimes prove it and not sell it, but everyone's got to do it as quickly as possible. We've run out of time to not be developing toward a resilient system that gets us out of some of the structural challenges we've really faced. So that's maybe a loaded statement, and I'm sort of laying some bait of, say, carbon markets are overhyped in agriculture, and yet still important, still a lot we can learn. But what's underhyped in agriculture in order to really make the do it happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. The underhyped aspects to me are everything other than carbon, literally everything other than carbon. And to set some context, I think about the complexities that make up our agricultural systems in the United States and globally. And I say systems because there is not just one type of farmer in the United States nor on the global basis. Setting some stage here and providing some context, there are over 2 million farm businesses in the United States. So it's a highly fragmented landscape. And these farm businesses are many times run by individuals or small organizations, small businesses, and they vary considerably in their resources, capacity, education, business management strategies, as you might expect with being small businesses. In addition to that, just understanding that there are over 2 million farmers, farm businesses, I think understanding the focus, the underhyped aspects of the interactions, the different system components. So we talk about farming systems. Well, what comprises those systems? Well, thinking about corn and soybeans, corn as an example, or soybeans as an example, we have seeding equipment, we have planting processes, we have insecticides or crop protection more generally. This could be whether organic or conventional or regenerative, whatever the term is. There are crop protection programs that are in place to help manage and optimize yields within those systems. In addition to that, we think about fertility management, soil health, the connection to cultural practices like tillage or no-till within those systems. We think about management for irrigation where that's applicable, management for harvest, marketing decisions, grain management systems, and this is grain world, but this extends into a whole system of marketing decisions and the vast complexities of agricultural markets. Think into derivatives and different types of options and different types of contracts, whether a farmer is going to play the futures or not. All of these complexities and all of these components are, in my opinion, the underhyped aspects as we're thinking about climate resiliency and climate smart agriculture more generally.
I love that answer. There's so much in there. I mean, at the end of the day, my interpretation is this is about figuring out how to do two things. One is capture greater value, and two is capture greater value for the environment. Sometimes those line up, sometimes they just don't. When do they or don't they line up?
It's a great question. I think they can line up with some of these system components. And what I hear some conversation around, especially on the financial aspect of things. Let me start with, say, nitrogen. We may have all heard of nitrogen. I'm sure we have. It's a very important nutrient for crop growth and development. Nitrogen is a very dynamic element as well within crop production. Nitrate and ammonium are highly mobile. They can enter bodies of water, enter the water solution within the soil and leach out of the system. They can be taken up within the crop and allocated into roots, into the shoots, into the grain. They can enter the atmosphere. They can volatilize through some changes within the soil. They're also incredibly important to the microbial community that surrounds the root, surrounds the crop, that actually mediates a lot of the processes that makes nitrogen available for the crops. So we have this very, very mobile, dynamic element that's critical for crop production, critical for our human health as well. And in creating the win-win opportunities or the alignment between the environment and crop production, what's good for nitrogen management for a farmer from a business standpoint is actually incredibly good for the environment as well. And as a co-benefit from an ecosystem service around provisioning and grain production, food production, it's really good for our society too. So when we have practices that enhance nutrient use efficiency and making sure that any nitrogen fertilizers that's applied ends up in the grain or the edible parts of the plant, that keeps that nitrogen out of the soil or out of the water, whether through leaching, keeps it out of the air, and nitrous oxide is a very potent greenhouse gas. And it makes good business sense because nitrogen is also a very, very costly input, very expensive input for the farmers. So this is an example of where we can create some wins across the board for the environment, for production, and for society as a whole.
A backdrop to the story that we'll cover in future episodes is this concept called the Green Revolution. And one thing about revolutions is once they happen, genie's out of the bottle. The Green Revolution, we figured out a way to make nitrogen available to crops and produce crops that are healthier, grow bigger, better, faster, and they're stronger. At the same time, there's some downsides. And it seems like some of what we're talking about is mitigating the abundance of nitrogen. But really spell it out for me in terms of the do it nitrogen efficiency. What is it going to take for people to really just wrap their heads around, if I use my nitrogen more efficiently, it's going to make financial sense and environmental sense? And where might carbon markets help or hinder that effort?
Yeah. So wrapping heads around this, this too is a complex issue because it's not just, a farmer doesn't just go order nitrogen on a whim and magically it shows up in the field the next day. That's not the case at all. It requires advanced planning, and nitrogen prices are actually pretty high right now because the supply chain is pretty tight, largely impacts within from the pandemic right now. So, but in general, input purchases require advanced planning and aligning financial components on the farm as well, financing options for farmers to purchase these inputs. So within this system where farmers are thinking about and trying to enhance nutrient use efficiency, the interacting components or the broader picture is that we have to align financing, we have to align labor, we have to align business incentives off the farm, so the ag retailers, the ag input providers, and then we have to align downstream supply chain programs that may have different stipulations on nitrogen. We have to align education and understanding. We have to align further financing for equipment purchases or leasing options to apply that nitrogen. And then we have to apply real-time decision making to monitor and grow that crop throughout the growing season and apply that nitrogen at the exact right time. And as part of that, we add in another component looking at in-field testing, decision-making tools, data keeping and records management, and these other interacting decisions at the same time. So that was a lot. Kind of taking a step back to the question at hand, because I was kind of going down a little bit of a rabbit hole there.
Won't fault you for having a PhD after your name. You're a professor.
So coming back to the question, and where carbon markets might help is providing additional incentive. Farmers, from a records keeping perspective, but also from a financial perspective, this aligns. And the carbon markets can provide an additional signal to the farm to maintain the records that are part of best business management practices, looking at fertilizer receipts, looking at as applied maps, cataloging, collecting precision ag data, and managing that to make better and enhanced business decisions in the future. The carbon markets and the requirements that are often part of carbon protocols or the standards by which the carbon markets operate oftentimes require these data to show and to prove and to verify that the practice is happening or the change in practice is happening. And in addition to that, there are financial incentives, not huge financial incentives right now. Typically, we're looking at anywhere from $3 to $20 an acre for a nitrogen protocol that might be tied to a carbon market. So it's about the cost of 1 to 1.5 herbicide applications for a farmer. So one of those many different decisions farmers are making. But it's signaling, and it's also looking into the crystal ball a little bit. So a farmer has the ability to maybe look downstream past their 1 year annualized crop cycle to see what's on the horizon, maybe 2, 3, or even up to 5 years out, and start to think about how their business might change in the next 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 years.
Great answer. So, Nick, I got a fortune cookie once that said perpetual optimism is a force multiplier. And that really resonated with me because I am an optimist and it takes one to know one. You're an optimist too. And there's a lot going on in this world that gives reason to be pessimistic about. And honestly, one of the things that I like about you is we have this acknowledgement that we don't want to have to do this job. Yes. And I couldn't, hey, everyone listening, if we all get our act together and fix climate change, we won't have to do this job. And we should really design ourselves into obsolescence so we don't have to do this job. So let's do some future casting from now. It's the year 2050. We've solved it. What does that look like so we don't have to do this job anymore in agriculture?
Oh man, yeah. Yeah. Well, carbon markets won't be a thing. Carbon protocols probably won't be a thing because we've solved it. We have balance, and we have restructuring of how we're conceiving, thinking about agriculture and our interactions between rural and urban communities, food supply chain systems. There's a lot, man. My mind is just spinning about the opportunities here and what this will mean when we solve for this. But we'll likely have different financial mechanisms where there are different financial support mechanisms for farmers that move us out of the current operational loan structure. And this is a little bit of an anecdote in a winding response to the question. But for anybody listening and watching, it's good going back to the previous answer of understanding the people and the driving decisions. Part of the significant part of an influential point for a set of decisions for farmers are thinking about capital and being able to produce their crops, having the financing on hand to produce their crops every year. And I speak from personal experience because I went through this with my family. We grew up, we did this not only in my family's farm, but also on the commercial potato farm. And then I've helped to support decisions for thousands of farmers throughout the country and thinking about these operational planning. So it's very typical for farmers to take on operational loans, okay, loans to help support business operations. So the purchase of inputs such as fertilizer, crop seed, equipment, things like that. And oftentimes these operational loans are on an annualized basis, a 1-year cycle, where the loan will be taken out in the winter or early spring, and it will be expected to be paid back later in the year. Well, sometimes these are tied to well, actually most times these operational loans are not only tied to business assets, they're also tied to personal assets of the farmer, houses, cars, jewelry, heirlooms, whatever the farmer can put up as collateral to support the risk that the banks are putting out. Long drawn out example, just for context. But in 2050, I would love to see these financial mechanisms completely gone. That we aren't relying on farmers to be so heavily leveraged by financial institutions, especially on annual cycles, to take on risks to manage components that they just can't control. So these risks with weather, with insects, with other pests, farmers can't control that. I'd like to see the support landscape changing. I'd like to see the supply chain programming changing. I'd like to see the incentives for farmers to maintain and operate their businesses in a way that balances economics, social, and environmental goods changing. If we solve for this, we'll solve for all of those, where those will be in balance, and there will be the right incentives and the right education and training to move our systems to meet those needs across 3 pillars of the sustainability stool.
I love that answer. And the bottom line is, we're not going to solve it individually. We can solve it collectively. And you said some key words. So maybe if I could succinctly describe what I think I heard you say is, we restore systems to balance. Balance is a key word. There's balance amongst how we produce goods that we consume, in this case, food, fiber, fuels. There's balance in the risk that is subsumed between the person taking the risk and the person underwriting the risk. And there's balance in the system as a whole. It's kind of all about balance. And it requires, and I hope maybe the listener, you today can think about what is or isn't out of balance in your own personal life or your own work, and what elements might exist to move toward a restoration of balance. I wish someone gave me that advice earlier in my career. It took me a while to figure that out. But Nick, what advice do you wish you had early on in your career, or maybe that you learned the hard way that you know now?
Ditto the balance. But coming from agriculture, just in terms of work hours and things like that, there isn't a lot of balance for work life at all. So that work life balance, I absolutely wish I would have really embraced that much earlier on. Also, the value of people and the drivers that bring people, or the underlying factors and drivers that bring people to that point in time in which you're working and conversing and helping to negotiate or have conversations with that person. That we all have, many of us have similar values, and understanding those values to values conversations and how they align to form a base level groundwork for us to work from is exceptionally important. I wish I would have learned that much earlier on in my career. Going forward, I definitely, that's something I try to optimize and think about. And in addition to that, it's maybe recognition as to these different system components again, and the importance that they bring in moving different agricultural systems, but also understanding and education of a broader public and the policy landscape that exists today, and the different incentive structures that can help change things. I don't think I had a broad appreciation of how all these different components work together.
Awesome. This has been a lot of fun. This has definitely been at the very high level, but we are going to take this podcast and zoom in, zoom out, swirl around, make your head spin, and uncover some of the stickier topics and ask with great curiosity so that we can all learn together. And from a Carbon A-List perspective, Nick, I am just stoked to continue to take on some of the work that we're already about and see where this journey takes us.
Yeah, likewise. I've really appreciated this conversation and the very thoughtful questions you're asking, Christoph. I look forward to this partnership and the growth for Carbon A-List. It's tremendous opportunity. Really, really appreciating it.
So if you're listening to this inaugural episode, please subscribe. We've got plenty more episodes in the hopper, and please follow us online and stay in touch. Thanks again.